Armored Core 6 is a remarkable game in many ways. Not only is it a bold continuation of a long dormant franchise which basically dominated the mech genre all throughout the 2000s, but it's also a statement from a studio which has had great success over the last decade, popularizing a new subgenre of games. If Fromsoftware simply wanted to make more money, they would have made Dark Souls 4, or at least another Souls-like game. But instead, they chose to go back to the series that originally put them on the map, although for only a fairly small audience. And after going back and playing a bunch of the older games from the franchise over the months leading up to Armored Core 6's release, I can safely say that this game is something special. I will blow my load right at the start of the video. I really like Armored Core 6. When I first started playing the Armored Core games last year, I was fairly generous with how I talked about the earlier entries in the series, as I evaluated them with the fact that some of them are more than 2 decades old in mind. So obviously they aren't really able to keep up with most good modern-day games, but some of the ideas and also their execution were already pretty excellent. The series has an incredibly strong foundation, rooted in the gameplay-first school of thought that Fromsoftware seems to have been subscribed to since its inception. So when it came to AC6, I was really hoping that it would take this great base established in the older titles, build upon it, and wrap it all in a level of polish you'd expect in a game released in 2023. And at least for me, Armored Core 6 has been able to meet almost all of my expectations and wishes. That doesn't mean that it's a perfect game, but it's a pretty damn good one. I want to start this review by talking about what I consider to be the most important aspect that Fromsoftware just had to get right with Armored Core 6. It's combat. Many people, myself included, think that a game lives and dies by its gameplay. There are a few exceptions, but if the gameplay is good, the game is good. It immediately gets like a 6 out of 10 from me if I can simply have a good time by just participating in the main gameplay loop and have it be fun on its own. And yet again, Fromsoftware somehow has managed to create another incredibly fun combat system, which has some major differences to the previous games, but in my humble opinion, pretty much all for the better. I know that I'm about to piss off a lot of hardcore AC purists, but the combat in the series has currently peaked with Armored Core 6. I really have pretty much no complaints I can throw at AC6's combat other than a few quality of life changes I'd love to see, or maybe a handful of bugs I have encountered. While many of the old-gen fans criticize its use of the Sekiro-style stagger meter, which completely changes the flow of combat, I think it greatly enhances it by creating this flow which almost turns every fight into a dance, especially while fighting bosses or other ACs. In addition to that, the fact that you can fire all of your weapons at the same time, not having to switch between your arms and back units, just feels right. And while we're on the topic of the feeling of combat, man, the movement? I already voiced my thoughts on this in a previous video. It's not that great, so you don't have to watch it, but the things I talked about in that video haven't really changed. I still think that the movement feels incredible, and combined with the aforementioned dance-like flow of the combat, just makes for such an enjoyable time controlling your mech. And in addition to that, if you don't like to enter into a dance with your opponent, you could also always just go for a different build, because when you put on those tank legs, you just keep on chugging until your opponent sees the light at the end of the tunnel. This brings me to another important component that directly contributes to the gameplay, which is your actual equipment. AC frame parts, arm units, back units, generators, FCS, booster, extensions, and OS tuning upgrades. The amount of viable builds you can go for in this game is really great, as you can make pretty much anything work if your skill allows it. On my first playthrough, I used this one specific energy pistol for pretty much the entire game. It was a fairly early unlock, and I just came to love it and held on to it pretty much until the end. But for subsequent playthroughs, I completely changed up my builds, which had me try numerous different playstyles. From my mid-weight bipedal AC that I used in New Game, to the slow and heavy but hard-hitting machine I was using in New Game Plus, or the lightweight and high mobility glass cannon I was rocking with in New Game Plus 2. There are so many different ways to play this game, which all just add to my opinion that the combat in this game is one of the greatest ones ever designed. And here is where I sadly have to start talking a little more negatively now. While all of the available parts are fun to use, I feel like it's missing some more weapon variety that the older games brought to the table. And by this I don't mean what I've heard many other people say, that they should bring back more systems that were present in the older games that added optional parts and more involved extensions and such. I just want more weapon types. More ways to game end my opponents. And for God's sake, please give us some more legs that aren't bipeds. I need to drift more tanks, I beg of you. There are some key parts that were present in the older games, like weapon arms, which I personally really loved, that I feel like should have been in the game from the start. Probably the weirdest weapons not to include in AC6 are snipers in my opinion, however. The game's got some really open maps with high vantage points from which you could have totally made use of snipers to safely dispatch of many threats. It would have even played really well into the fact that you'd have to bring something else to be viable at close range as well, as many of the more open missions have some sort of boss fight towards the end. Thankfully though, Fromsoftware has already shown that they can and will add new parts with just regular updates. Like the recently released Lamagaya parts, for example. It wasn't much, but chances are that we might get more in the future, be it through updates or an expansion later on. Next, we have to talk about the missions of AC6, which also includes the actual stages and the enemies found within them. The game is divided up into 5 chapters, each one leading you to new areas of Rubicon, which are capped off by an epic boss fight. To start this off, I sadly have a little nitpick when it comes to the pacing of the chapters. Is it a nitpick? Is it an actual problem? I don't know, but it's something. The chapters aren't equal in length. In theory, not a problem, but it becomes one when you go from the lengthy and very well done Chapter 1 to the 3-mission long Chapter 2. 3 missions, and honestly one of them can hardly be counted as one, as it reuses a small section of the previous mission and does nothing new and exciting with it. I don't mind the existence of short levels, but there were some which I feel really ended up sucking. This short mission in Chapter 2 is a good example. It's right after a really good level, with an expansive environment to explore, with many little secrets to uncover, culminating in a big boss fight. And then you play this really short level that's not really interesting and also reuses parts of the same stage. The only redeeming quality this mission has is that there is a specific type of MT which never shows up anywhere else. I really don't know why they chose to put a unique enemy in specifically this mission, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really make this mission any better. This also isn't the only short mission falling flat after a long one, but it's the most egregious example, which, at least for me, messes with the pacing of that part of the game. And the extra missions you get through the New Game Plus playthroughs just exacerbate this issue. This really makes me think there might have been more missions which had to be cut during development for one reason or another. But other than this issue, I'm fairly happy with the missions in this game. While playing through the earlier entries in the series, I had always imagined what it would be like if I was able to explore a more detailed and expansive environment, which AC6 definitely delivered on. The very first mission, Illegal Entry, perfectly sets up expectations on the scale of environments and the grandness of your journey in general. Looking over the vast, frigid landscape of Rubicon and the huge man-made structures in the distance is a great introduction to all of the different kinds of sights you're going to see while exploring this planet. Chapter 1 is very well done in general. Over the course of the 11 missions you'll have to go through, the game teaches you a lot of things, and shows you what kind of different mission types and objectives you will encounter later on. It also doesn't fail to deliver on big set pieces and memorable moments, like attacking and taking down the absolutely gigantic Strider. And let's not forget one of, if not the most infamous boss of the game, which has caused many rage-filled discussion threads online by those who got repeatedly flattened for hours. Balteus is the first big roadblock of the game, and is lovingly called the Great Filter of Armored Core 6. On release, this boss was absolutely ruthless, but since then, there has been a patch that nerfed him slightly. Many lament this change, but I personally don't really mind. This fight is still a lot of fun and a great spectacle, which officially concludes Chapter 1. Now, I think this might be a good time to address the game's difficulty in general. You will find many differing opinions online. Some say the game is too hard and unforgiving. Some say it's super baby easy and the earlier games in the series were way harder. In my opinion, the difficulty is just fine. Would I make some changes? Sure. Does the game's difficulty hinder my enjoyment of the game as it is? No. A very popular take I've seen many times is that the game has too many random spikes in difficulty. For example, the small enemies within the levels are complete pushovers. The regular MTs you'll fight are killable with just a few shots of any basic weapon. But then, when you reach a boss, for example Bolteus, the difficulty just goes through the roof, with the boss itself being able to kill you with just a few well-placed shots. While I don't blame anyone for thinking that this is a bit jarring, I honestly think this isn't as big of an issue as some people make it out to be. It's true that the early game MTs are very underpowered, but it makes sense that they would be. Your AC is far more advanced than they are, so you can quickly steamroll them, with their only chance of doing some significant damage coming from larger groups of enemies that can overwhelm you. Also, the further you go in your playthrough, the stronger and more dangerous the regular enemies will become, and the frequency of the special enemies also increases. To me, it felt like a fairly well-designed ramp-up in difficulty, and I personally just don't really have much to complain about. And when it comes to the bosses, none of the major fights really took me more than an hour. It took some time getting used to the movesets and possibly adapting my playstyle or build, but I never really got that frustrated or mad at anything being too easy or too difficult. When it comes to the rest of the game's chapters, I want to add a few more things that I feel are important to mention here as well. The further I got into the game, the more I started to wish that the places we were visiting on Rubicon weren't just mostly comprised of snowy landscapes. This obviously wasn't a problem for the sections that take place within the man-made structures, or the underground, but most of the overworld missions were set in some sort of snowy landscape. This isn't a huge problem, just something to note. Especially because there were still some really cool standout set pieces sprinkled all throughout the game. For example, the Strider mission I was talking about earlier, or that really long mission at the start of Chapter 2, or the time where you find this massive underground city which is probably tied with the floating city Xylem as one of the coolest reveals in the game. So in short, while there are a bunch of really interesting and cool set pieces in the game, a little bit more visual variety would have been nice. When it comes to the enemy variety in the later chapters of the game, I really have nothing to complain about. Like I've said, the new enemies introduced towards the end of your playthrough can be pretty unique and way more difficult than the ones you face at the start, and it kept the combat and the encounters relatively fresh all throughout my time with the game. Same can be said for the bosses. While some of the later bosses don't really live up to the early high of Bolteus, most of them were really enjoyable fights. The only criticism I can think of right now would be the use of a regular AC fight as one of the final bosses. While that fight had a lot of significance in terms of the game's story, and was one that was conceptually interesting to me, it didn't really have the same kind of quality as the other two final bosses the game has to offer. I originally wrote this video in a kind of critique style where I would go over pretty much every single thing that there is in the game. But along the way, I kind of realized that I wanted this to be more of a review, a reflection of my thoughts and feelings about the game, while maybe telling you, the game is good, you can give it a shot yourself if you haven't played it yet. That is partly because I don't really feel like I'm ready yet for an insightful and well-written critique. My writing skills are just not on that level yet. But if you have watched the video up until now and you have enjoyed it, maybe consider subscribing, maybe leave a like, so I know that I'm doing something right with these videos. And also be sure to tell me in the comments if you enjoy the style of review. This is my first time trying out this kind of thing, so any kind of feedback would help. But let's talk about a few more things that I kinda left out of the main part of the video. For example, the PvP, the customization options for the visuals of your mech, or stuff like the OST and the sound design, which I haven't really touched anything on. But first, I quickly want to elaborate on why I think Armored Core 6 is the new peak of the Armored Core series. Like I've said, I probably pissed off a lot of hardcore Armored Core purists or fans of the older generations. Because Armored Core 6 truly does a lot of things different while still keeping that same base the older games established. One of the systems that defined the old generation of games was the debt system, where if you were to lose, if you were to fuck up the mission, you would start losing a lot of money in the process. And this was something that I personally really enjoyed when I played the older games, as many other people have as well. However, The big problem with that system was that it kinda locked you out of experimenting with a lot of things, at least not until you knew what you were doing. And to me personally, I value the fact that in Armored Core 6 that I can just try anything out without really any repercussion if I fail. I can just go back to the assembly screen, try out some different things, and I can be happy without worrying about too many things. This is just something where people will have different opinions. I have my opinion, you will have your opinion. We can agree to disagree. If you enjoy the old system more than the newer systems, that's totally fine. But personally for me, I think Armored Core 6 just does most of the things I want to see in a mech game. I just want to shoot big gun and not really have to care about anything else. And shooting the gun has to feel good. That's also important. This might just be a case of me going gamer goblin mode and other people wanting to do, all the preparation stuff, really thinking about, do I need this on the mission? Again, it's just, you like your thing, I like my thing, and that's okay. Another thing that I believe has been done really well in Armored Core 6 is the customization of your mech in terms of how it actually looks. You can just choose whatever colors you want, you can choose the finish of the color, you can have some decals slapped on there, and if you have paid any attention to our community PvP sessions, which by the way, you should drop by one of those, you'll know that people have made some truly unhinged designs and some really cool ones as well, so all I'm gonna say is Tony Soprano, that one really kind of surprised me. But again, there were a lot of really cool designs as well. When it comes to the OST and the sound design of the game, I have a bunch of problems. It's not that the sound design or the OST is necessarily bad, it is just fine. Most of my issues with the OST especially stems from the fact that there are only a handful of memorable tracks. All of the other tracks do their thing, they're fine in the context they're played, they perfectly fit with the setting of the game, they fit with the themes and the tone, but I also want an OST to be memorable, something that I can maybe listen to even without just playing the game. And sadly, I didn't really find that here in Armored Core 6. I keep mentioning it, but for example, Armored Core 2's OST was way more memorable and had way cooler tracks that I love talking about and that I'm probably gonna use in this video as well, because I didn't really want to use the Armored Core 6 OST. It's just not that great. And the sound design is kind of the same. It's serviceable. It's just fine, but there was something missing. When I first started playing the game, I immediately noticed that there was a distinct lack of impact. Be that maybe just through some missing low frequencies, maybe we just needed more bass, because it didn't feel like I was piloting a huge robot. It felt hollow. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but that's kind of how it felt. There wasn't enough power behind most of the things. Again, it's not bad, it's just not quite on the level that I would have liked it to be. Another aspect that I pretty much didn't talk about at all was the game's story and its characters, which, in my opinion, are actually amazing. There was this thing going around for a while where reviewers just said, oh, the game has no story. The game, it's a Fromsoftware game, so it has no story. Which is just not true at all. It's kind of like saying death metal isn't music, which it obviously is. It's just maybe not for you. And Fromsoftware has always done this thing where if you don't really pay attention to the story, they're not going to feed it to you. You really need to look closely at every single piece of dialogue you can find, every single data log you collect in order to piece together what has happened. You can definitely understand maybe not everything, but most of the things that happen in the game just by paying attention, which most people just don't do enough in this game. And that's not a problem. If people don't want to pay attention to the story in these games and just enjoy the gameplay, which is what I like to do most of the time as well, so I don't blame them. But saying that the game has no story just feels really disingenuous, especially when you have some really good characters in the game. All of these characters will at some point probably receive their own video, and it's most likely gonna take a while. And I truly believe that in terms of story and characters, Armored Core 6 is also, again, the peak of the series. Weapon balance, especially in PvP, is also a huge problem and something that FromSoft has never really gotten right, and this game is no exception, but we can only hope that they address more and more things with patches in the future, which they've already done, but honestly, recently the patches have been kinda slow and there hasn't been a patch in a while, so we'll just have to see what happens. Maybe an expansion or a DLC will fix or bring a lot of new problems, but only time will tell. And now, I quickly want to go over some of the things you guys said about Armored Core 6. I asked in the Discord what your thoughts about the game are, something you really like in the game, something you really hate maybe, and something you would like to see added or changed with an expansion, DLC, updates, whatever. So these were the questions that I asked you guys in the Discord, and by the way, if you haven't joined the Discord already, maybe consider doing so, because we have a lot of cool stuff here. We have curated a really nice community that I'm really proud of, and I'm sure you'll like it here as well. But for now, I asked what's something you really liked about AC6, what's something you really disliked about AC6, what would you like to see added or changed with an expansion? And you guys have delivered in spades. There are a lot of comments here, so let's go through some of them. First up, Randall was saying that he liked the voice acting of AC6, he disliked the fact that there was too much snow, so someone else also kind of shared the same sentiment that I had. And he really wanted a bit more of Grid 085, which, who knows, maybe we'll see some more, because I'm pretty sure that's the Chapter 2 location, which again, that would be a very nice thing for FromSoft to add more things to with an expansion, however that could go. Makuti is saying that they like the customization and dripping out the ACs, which I can definitely agree with. Of course, someone just had to say Rusty. It was... everyone likes Rusty. I have to check if anyone dislikes Rusty. There might be a fun video to try to figure out if people actually dislike Rusty, but we'll see about that one. And we have Theo here saying that the characters make up a big part of the enjoyment of the story, which I definitely agree with, and the voice acting also helps the whole thing. And Burp here also agrees with me that the general flow of the combat and the different ways that you can play the game really make this something special. And also, this is an interesting thing here, we also definitely need some kind of co-op, which, yes, there is already a mod in the making for this game, by the way, that will bring co-op into existence, but who knows, maybe a DLC could add something in, we'll have to see, although I think Fromsoftware has clarified that they think this game is a single-player experience, so one can only hope. Not a dislike, but more of a nitpick. I kind of wish there were more environments, that Chapter 2 and 5 had been longer. Again, that's also what I was talking about. More wishes for co-op, I totally agree. And it's also kind of a shame that the Strider was really the only instance of the game having a large-scale boss fight like this. Although you could argue maybe the Xylem... Nah. We got Zarian with an absolute zinger of a message here. I'm gonna keep that on screen for a bit here so you can read through all of this, but I'm not gonna... I don't know how long the video is, so this might be a bit too much. Again, join the Discord so you can have a look at all of the stuff yourself and you can discuss about these things, which I'm also active in here, and... yeah. If you enjoy the style of review, please tell me in the comments. If you really hated it, please also tell me in the comments. I won't be mad at you, I promise, unless you say some stupid shit. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Again, like, subscribe, all that jazz. Here are my amazing channel members. I can't thank you enough for being a channel member. Some people have already been members for 4 or 5 months at this point, so truly, thank you all. I really appreciate it. This second part of the video was so scuffed. We will see what makes it into the video, and now I need to stop it and edit everything. Woo, it's gotta go up on the channel. It's gonna be amazing.